because the goal is not to take Taiwan. That's not China's goal. It's well beyond that. They're under no obligation to fight. So if there was actual conflict, um, there's a belief that maybe as many as one third, 33% of the soldiers might actually leave the self-defense forces. And the 2010 law that was passed within China applies not only to Chinese who are living in Japan, but Chinese who live abroad. So in the countries that your viewers are watching from, in your country too, the Chinese there would be obligated to conduct sabotage operations. A lot of people are going to be hurt, injured, killed because of the unwillingness over the years for experts to speak their mind uh, and to speak out on these issues.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Robert Eldridge, who is the president, among others, president of the Eldridge Think Tank and an award-winning author. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I noticed in your LinkedIn profile you have a very intriguing line. You're saying you're working internationally in a collaborative manner against difficult odds. That's very intriguing. What does it mean?
So yeah, I've spent most of my life outside of the United States, and I spent majority of that time in Asia. So I seek to kind of be a bridge between the United States and other countries, particularly my adopted home of Japan. Although currently I live in Taiwan, and trying to be a bridge between the three countries.
And how long have you been in Japan?
34 years.
I know you were invited to the presidential inauguration ceremony in May. Could you talk a little bit? How was it, and what's your impression of the current president and the vice president?
Yes, thank you. So May 20th was the presidential inauguration for here in Taiwan. Um, this is my second inauguration to attend. The first one was back in 2016 on the same day, May 20th, for President Tsai and and her team. Um, the inauguration ceremonies were, you know, very nice. I think the tone of the speech, many of us who are supporters of Taiwan were very happy with the speech. Uh, we don't think it was provocative at all. Um, President Lai is a very, popular leader, um, and I think you know, I think he really spoke from the heart. He has a, very difficult upbringing, as you may know, and some of your viewers may know. Comes from very, poor background, and very much a hard worker. He was very successful in in politics, and I think he's going to be a very successful, leader. So I look forward to his administration.
Yeah, that's quite the opposite to China because the presidents here, like Chen Shui-bian, came from extreme poverty. Tsai Ing-wen is from, what should we say, upper middle class. So it's actually what the Chinese claim, but it's actually doable here in Taiwan, right? Quite an interesting, quite the opposite. And also, a female being twice a president. So that's really how it should be, right?
Mhm. Yeah, so in President Lai's case, his father passed away right after his birth in a mining accident. I believe he was one of six children, and worked extremely hard, throughout his life. So, and his vice president also has a very unique background. She was born in Kobe, the city where I live normally. and spent a lot of time in the United States. Is part Taiwanese, part American. Although she, citizenship wise, she's adopted completely Taiwanese citizenship. Um, and both of them are, well respected, both as politicians as well as, statesmen, stateswomen. And I enjoy watching their activities every day. I live about 6 or 7 minutes from the presidential office here in Taipei, and so I'm down in that area every day.
I know you're quite familiar with the Japanese military situation. What would you say? How is the modernization? How are the changes going on?
In Japan.
Yes.
Um, so I go back to Japan usually once a month to touch base to see how things are going there. Um, Japan, is having been there for more than 3 decades. I can say that it's certainly much more open, and it's easier for non-Japanese to live there and to start business there, and to do things. Um, but on the innovation side, I think it's much too slow, much too rigid, uh, kind of outdated thinking, uh, an unwillingness to reform. And I think Japan is in desperate need of a change in leadership in all areas, to a younger generation. I know that a lot of the younger generation is very frustrated in all types of work with the older generation. And we call the older generation the Showa generation. So that was the period up until 1989. So people that were born during those years have sort of an older way of thinking about things versus the people who were born after that in what's called the Heisei period. Uh, my two children, for example, are 25 and 22, and they're much more entrepreneurial minded, innovative, flexible. They move quickly, operate quickly, whereas the older generation tends to make decisions so much more slowly. And in today's times, you need to be able to make decisions much more quickly, or else international events or international competition is going to override you.
And how is it now with the Japanese, let's say, military? Because there has been a lot going on, and is it is it also as slow and kind of old-fashioned as you kind of describe Japan, the older generation, or is it more vital? How is it going there?
The Japanese military, um, being a military, it's very, hierarchical and structured. I've had interaction with the Japanese military called the Self Defense Forces for 29 years. My relationship with the Japanese military is actually longer than my relationship with the U.S. military or the U.S. Marine Corps, in which I worked for two different periods. Um, so I find they tend to be much more um, hierarchical and also stovepiped, which means they're kind of separated. So they don't really practice jointness and working together well. And I saw that, in person during the March 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, that they worked separately and they didn't work well together. But since then, over the past 13 years, they've made a concentrated effort to improve that. Um, One thing that's very interesting about the self defense forces, and I compare it to the U.S. Marine Corps in that, and maybe in the U.S. military as a whole, in that they became busier after the Cold War. So their missions have increased dramatically, but the size of the force hasn't increased for the most part, and in some cases actually decreased. So they have to do more with less. And so that creates, as you can imagine, a lot of stress on an organization. And so sometimes there have been people that have, have left the military because of either the bureaucracy or the stress. Um, so when that happens, it lowers morale quite a bit. In a actual wartime situation, the self-defense forces haven't had any actual combat experience. So they were formed officially in 1954. There was a predecessor organization before that that started in 1950. So basically for 75 years, they haven't had any practical wartime experience. Um, they're under no obligation to fight. So if there was actual conflict, um, there's a belief that maybe as many as one third, 33% of the soldiers might actually leave the self-defense forces. So, uh, they're not combat ready, and uh, they're not fully combat ready, or they don't have combat experience, and there's no obligation to fight. So there's a concern about when push comes to shove, when there's an actual conflict, what will happen.
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
But from what I know, their navy is quite advanced. It's probably the best in Asia, right? So maybe that's their one strong point.
That I think that's up for debate.
Okay.
Okay, so in certain equipment, the self-defense forces are better. Um, if you consider the U.S. military strong, uh, and the self-defense forces have been trained, and they exercise with the U.S. military, so they've learned the latest doctrine, the latest methods. Um, many have attended U.S. military schools, so uh, they do have access to some of the best equipment and the best information and training. Um, and in some cases, some of the best training areas, because they train in some cases in the United States. Their budget, unfortunately, though, has been quite low over the years, and only recently has the central government agreed to increase the budget. However, most estimates look at the Chinese military budget as much, much higher. And some of the estimates, for example, by the American Enterprise Institute, see the Chinese military budget as basically on par with the U.S. military budget. And the Chinese military budget, one thing that's interesting about it is that it doesn't really need to do much in the area of research and development, because China steals a lot of the military technologies. And some of it is dual use, so they can purchase some of that. And so they don't actually have to spend a lot of money on the research and development. Therefore, they can use that money for manufacturing and other purposes. So they're able to, I think, utilize their budget probably a lot better. And they're they're doing real world training. And living in Taiwan, I see that essentially every day. So, um, yeah. So if I were to compare right now the Chinese military and the Japanese military, unfortunately, I would have to say that the Chinese military is probably at an advantage. Whether it's superior or not, that's another debate. So quality versus quantity. Um, but I'm very worried about the situation here.
Basically, that's the same what I hear from American guests on my show with military background. They say kind of the same thing, which is very saddening. Um,
Hmm.
most people consider Taiwan probably the flashpoint in Asia, like the most endangered and threatened place. But actually, according to research, Japan has to deal with way more threats because it has to deal with incursions both from China, Russia, and North Korea, both naval and aerial. Is it really in such a much worse situation than Taiwan? How is it being perceived? Because as you see here in Taiwan, people don't really care, no matter how big the exercise is. During Pelosi's visit, or later when Tsai Ing-wen met McCarthy, whatever happens, everyone is cool and chills in Taiwan. Is it the same in Japan?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. So, um, yeah, so at the very minimum, Japan has, three hostile neighbors that are nuclear armed. There's no other country in the world really that faces the threats that Japan, has. Um, as many of your viewers will know, Japan and Russia still haven't signed a peace treaty following World War II. So technically, they're at a state of war. And uh, Russia still occupies four of Japan's islands off of the northern main island of Hokkaido. So there's a constant tension in the relationship. And every so often, Russia will seize a Japanese fishing boat, for example. Uh, so there's been historic tensions, over the years. With North Korea, the relationships not particularly good either. And with China, even though there's a peace treaty that was signed in 1978, um, I think China's in violation of that peace treaty, uh, because if you remember, it the two countries, China and Japan, agreed not to become uh, hegemons in the region, and so China is clearly a hegemon in the region. So China, in my opinion, is in serious violation of its of the peace treaty. Also, another aspect of the peace treaty is that they agreed to respect the territorial claims or territorial status of each other. And China, as you know, every day
Yes.
seeks to chip away at the islands that Japan has administered since 1972, uh, but it actually goes back to 1895. So for almost 130 years, islands that were under Japanese control, China now, because it's stronger militarily, is really ramping up its lawfare, economic warfare, political warfare, and military efforts to seize those islands. So, uh, Japan faces those external threats, and there's also a concern about internal sabotage. So, Japan has a large population of uh, of Korean, in this case, North Korean residents and some of those organizations that represent uh, North Korean residents in Japan have long been funneling money and information to North Korea, which would help it in a conflict with Japan. And as your viewers will also know, there's been the question of the abductions that started back in 1963. So there have been literally hundreds of Japanese that have been uh, either known to have been abducted or believed to have been abducted by North Korea. So that's also a violation of Japanese sovereignty. And then within Japan, there are roughly 1 million Chinese
Yes, exactly.
citizens,
That's what I wanted to ask about. Yes.
right? And the degree of sabotage that they could cause is very serious. Um, and I'm not saying that all Chinese uh, would want to do that or would feel that way, but since 2010, Chinese citizens abroad are obligated
Yes.
uh, to cooperate with their government uh, for for in a conflict. So they would be essentially obligated to be involved in information operations and sabotage. It's very, very easy to disrupt the generally calm and peaceful running of the Japanese country. And in some of my writings, I described where different strategic or tactical strikes could take place against Japan on the civilian side that would completely paralyze the country. So it can be very dangerous in that regard. And the 2010 law that was passed within China applies not only to Chinese who are living in Japan, but Chinese who live abroad. So in the countries that your viewers are watching from, in your country too, the Chinese there would be obligated to conduct sabotage operations.
It's not like in the US, the Chinese show a lot of interest around military bases, and they do it both in the US and in Japan, of course, and that's very dangerous. But they also involved in politics. They influenced the Okinawan independence movement. They also have leverage over the parliament and the pro Taiwanese Abe faction in the Liberal Democratic Party. So they exert a lot of influence. Maybe you could talk a little bit about all those instances, both around the bases in Okinawa and in the parliament.
Very good, thank you. So yes, so as part of China's uh, larger, strategy, political warfare, an aspect of that is called elite capture, where they essentially are able to control the leadership in a foreign country, and it could be the economic leadership, the political leadership, the military leadership, the academic leadership, industry, police. So any of the key stakeholders within a country, uh, you know, China uh, can be able to control or influence, and that could be through, money. It could be through compromising situations. So quite often that's known as honey trap or some other type of situation. It could be through almost like a hostage like situation where uh, somebody that is important to that individual is being controlled by by Chinese operatives, or there could be family members who are controlled by them. So uh, so there's a number of ways that they practice that. Within Japan, there's a belief that approximately half of the politicians are essentially under the sway of China
Oh my
to
God.
different degrees. Um, so that's very worrisome. You mentioned the independence movement in Okinawa. They are very tied to China, uh, and um, uh, they have sponsored conferences in China. Um, uh, there are uh, groups in China, or I'm sorry, in Okinawa, that are Chinese led or dominated, that have interactions with uh, politicians, economic groupings, universities, uh, and uh, and certain local administrations have also been heavily influenced by China. In the case of Okinawa Prefecture, its governor uh, has had very close ties. Its current governor and its the immediate predecessor had very close ties with China. Um, so these are all documented, and internet search will help readers discover them. Other things that China has been doing is they've been able to get weapons into Japan and stockpile them
Yes, same as
uh,
in
in,
Taiwan. Yes.
in near key infrastructure locations. Um, and the Chinese mafia is one of the main runners of this, smuggling of weapons operations. And the weapons are beyond what like a thug, a criminal would use. These have other purposes, and so yeah, it's a very precarious situation. I don't think Japan, the government, takes the threat as seriously, and it could be because of elite capture, that they're told not to pursue the issue further. Currently, the Japanese government is a coalition government, and they've been a coalition government for close to 24 years now. And one of there are two parties in the coalition government. The smaller party uh, has very close ties to China. It's called the Komeito, or Clean Government Party. And before they became really a national party, their leader had developed very close ties with China. Those relationships continued over the decades. And then when they joined the coalition in the early 2000s, they were increasingly able to exercise influence over the ruling party, the main ruling party. One of the reasons they were able to do that is the main ruling party became weaker and weaker electorally. So they needed the smaller party in key uh, constituencies to win. So they formed electoral partnerships, cooperation. And so the Liberal Democratic Party has been dependent on the smaller party. But I think that strategy worked maybe until the 2010s, but I don't think it's valid anymore. And I've long called for the LDP to break with the Komeito, because I see it as doing more harm than good. An example of the harm that it does is since December 2012, the Komeito, so the pro-China party, has always held the position of Minister of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport, uh, or Tourism. I don't know what they're calling it now. And that position controls the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard has to deal with the Chinese intrusions around the Senkakus. So there's a lot of pressure on the men and women on the front line that every day have to deal with the Chinese intrusions, and they want to exercise the full extent of the law, but sometimes there's a political break on what they can do. And so, uh, unfortunately, the Japanese are kind of surrendering their own sovereignty due to a fear of aggravating China, in part because of this elite capture.
Yeah, it sounds all very depressing and sad. Like when you look at how really successful China is, and basically everywhere in the US, in Taiwan, Japan, also a
Hmm.
lot of influence in the Philippines. It's really, really very saddening. And I wanted to ask you about one particular issue because I know you're familiar with it. Um, the Japanese islands closest to Taiwan. I wanted to ask about the logistical background because you said in an emergency they would have to be supplied, and there is a lot of problems like how the civilians and those, let's say, pro-independence organizations, once they might influence, maybe protest, maybe prevent the army from moving around. And the other thing is just logistically very difficult. Could you talk a little bit about this topic?
Yeah, so the island chain that comes close to Taiwan is called the Nansei Shoto, Nansei Islands. Uh, the islands are divided between two states or two prefectures. The northern Ryukyu Islands belong to Kagoshima Prefecture. The southern Ryukyu Islands make up their own prefecture called Okinawa. Uh, the westernmost island in Okinawa Prefecture, the Okinawa group, is called Yonaguni. And from Yonaguni, you can actually see Taiwan uh, on a clear day. The next island, it's actually a group, is called the Yaeyama group or Ishigaki. And then next you have Miyako. Um, for the longest time, there was a weak or non-existent self-defense force presence on these outer islands. That began to change about a decade and a half ago, almost 2 decades ago. They began realizing that China's militarization was growing rapidly, and they were Chinese naval vessels and aircraft were increasingly infringing upon the Nansei Islands. So they needed to develop a presence to monitor and possibly respond to um, any Chinese aggression in the area. Uh, and they're basically in the final stages of completing all of that. But because they're on islands, they're separated from one another. And so logistically, supplying, resupplying, moving them around is going to be dependent on air and maritime assets. There are no uh, air and maritime assets nearby. So I personally, and I've argued this publicly for a long time, I don't think Japan is well structured uh, to deal with the contingency in the Nansei Islands. Um, so I've long argued that its fighter jets should not be in Naha in Okinawa proper, but should be down near Miyako on an island called Shimoji Island, Shimoji Shima, which has a 3,000 meter beautiful runway. And from there, they can handle any scrambles that are necessary in the in the airspace around the Nansei Islands. Currently, they have to fly all the way from Naha and go south, or go west. And that creates a lot of wear and tear on not only the aircraft, but also on the pilots, because essentially every day they have to scramble. China, being essentially closer, can constantly send its aircraft or vessels into the area. And because they have more numbers and are better funded, they can basically create a war of attrition without there being an actual war or blows being struck. Um, and they're doing the same thing to Taiwan too, as you know. So earlier this year, in February March timeframe, China unilaterally changed the flight route uh, to the east, more towards Taiwan, which means that uh, aircraft would be crossing the median line, which necessitates the Taiwanese Air Force to scramble. And it also necessitates their land batteries to be prepared. So it creates a lot of wear and tear on the equipment, on the pilots, on the crews, on the ground staff crews, and then it also drains their petroleum resources. And so, unfortunately, Taiwan doesn't have a lot of, petroleum, and that's a new concern in the Nansei Islands too. So, the logistics in for example, a Taiwan contingency, or logistically, will be a huge challenge for any conflict in the Nansei Islands and as well as Taiwan itself. And fuel is an issue that I don't think is getting proper attention. And when the Middle East was, controlled by the United States, there was less of an issue about fuel. But now, with China's influence having grown tremendously over the Middle East in recent years, and certain oil producing countries in the Middle East unhappy with the Biden administration, as well as the war in Ukraine and all the changed international dynamics, securing fuel during a contingency will be a a challenge that really hasn't been an issue in modern warfare for the U.S. So it's a whole new dynamic now, I think.
Yeah, especially with the BRICS countries coming closer together. So this would be an
Exactly.
issue for them. Okay, yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's a very
my
valid
whole
point.
point about a Taiwan-Strait scenario is that it's not your it's not your grandfather's Taiwan-Strait situation, is an expression we have in the United States. So, it's not the way it was done. It's completely new. So it's going to be it's going to be global in nature. Certainly it's going to be multi-front, to involve North Korea, Russia, keeping Japan preoccupied, and also the United States. You're going to have logistic challenges, particularly with the fuel. It's going to be multi-domain. So my point is, it's not limited to the Taiwan Strait anymore. And I don't think anybody in my country, in Washington D.C., understands that, or even in Hawaii, where Indo-PACOM's located.
So even the military didn't catch up with the reality.
I would say many in the military haven't adjusted to reality. Um, Unfortunately, in today's U.S. military, political correctness overrides, um, and careerism overrides objective, courageous, intellectual honesty. And so a lot of people are going to be hurt, injured, killed because of the unwillingness over the years for experts to speak their mind uh, and to speak out on these issues,
Maybe
to include
just
within the U.S. government and military.
Liking and subscribing is greatly appreciated, and it helps me keep this channel going. My goal is to spread the opinions and experience of the best people in this industry.
last few sentences to wrap it up. What
Okay.
are you researching in 24, 25? What are you looking into in the coming year?
I'm always doing a lot of different research topics. And so one topic that I'm interested in right now is the so-called silicon shield theory about how Taiwan is protected because it's so valuable to the international economy and to China's economy that China wouldn't attack. I don't believe that. And so I'm looking at the origins of that idea, the theory, and arguments for and against it to get a better understanding of that idea. My uh, my initial reaction is I don't believe it, but I haven't made a conclusion yet about that. But in general, I'm concerned about arguments that say that China won't do this or China won't do that. It's not rational for China to do it. It's entirely rational for China to do a lot of the things it's going to do. Because the goal is not to take Taiwan. That's not China's goal. It's well beyond that. It's to
Absolutely,
drive.
totally
It's,
agree.
dri- it's
Yes,
to drive the U.S. out of
yes.
Asia. It's to neutralize Japan. It's to cause other countries in Asia, particularly Philippines and Vietnam, other countries in Southeast Asia, to become subjugated to China. It's to redeploy the People's Liberation Army and military forces to divide the First Island chain and give them complete access to the entire Western Pacific, and then from there to the to the Western Hemisphere easily. So if people think, oh, it's just about Taiwan, no, it's not. It's much bigger than that.
Yeah, that's interesting that, let's say, we, Taiwan or Japan, hence, that's how we see it. But unfortunately, people back home, they don't see it that way. But we here, we know actually what's going to happen. Robert, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your insights.
My pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.